Okay, good evening, everybody. Tonight's year, I was asked to speak a little bit about the topic I'm currently going over again. This is my second time through laws of Ammon and Ezer, Jewish family law. And Zach has asked me to speak specifically about one of the inyanim that I'm learning currently, although I have gone through the breadth of information of Ammon and Ezer. If we would like another topic, we can always pick another one. And specifically, who is permitted to marry within the Jewish people. This is a topic that has been plaguing the Jewish people for 2 centuries. Just to give you a little bit of background about why it's been a bigger issue now than it's ever been possibly in the past. With the introduction of civil marriage into highly enlightened 19th century European world, they allowed Christians and Jews to intermarry for the first time with the introduction of the civil marriage. Civil marriage seems like something that would make a lot of sense, but it actually it simply created an avenue for people to no longer have to adhere to their religion. And that really spoke to sort of the enlightened 19th century world of moving sort of beyond the confines of the way they practice religion. The state was becoming the central force, and basically people no longer had to be adherence to a church or a religion of any kind or some recognized religion, and could simply go ahead and get married. For the most part, this really only impacted the Jewish people because they were basically barred from any form of civil entry unless they either went through their own Bati Din, their own Jewish courts, or they converted to Christianity. And this was sort of the middle ground whereby a number of Jewish people sort of entered into the modern secular world. And for those who were interested in it, it's quite an interesting topic. Practically speaking, there actually are cases of people who could be part of the Jewish people but are not permitted to marry other Jewish people. And the Simanim early on in Ammon and Ezer, when it talks about with whom is it proper to marry and is it permitted and prohibited to marry, there is a number of discussions about whom one would be able to marry. So I actually go through, I'm sorry, my notes didn't close over here, give me 1 second. There actually is a number of categories of people who may not marry other Jewish people by either reason of their yichus, their heritage, or
their pedigree, right?
Their pedigree. Yeah. Usually when I think of pedigree, I think of the animal. So I think of pedigree, I think of like what kind of horse is this, what kind of dog is this, but by reason of how they are.
What's the translation to pedigree?
It's pedigree just means where they came from. I just think of dog food when I think of pedigree.
Geza.
What?
No.
No.
Shoshelet.
No. It's their yichus.
Heritage.
Yichus. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yichus is the word. And so I actually put together a little introduction over here that I'm going to read for you before we get into this. It's a short introduction. I think it really gives you an idea of what it means to have certain classes of people whom other Jews can and cannot marry. So the Torah enumerates 5 classes of persons with whom another Jew may not contract a marriage, and those some types of relationships that are punishable by death in the heavenly court, like incestual relationships.
What is the first one?
Incestual relationships. So incestual, like there are certain ones that are within the family that is basically punishable by the heavenly courts. It's Misudei Shemayim, the Karis. And those are enumerated in the Torah. We'll get to that. And that's actually not even discussed in our Siman.
Those are Midoraisa?
Those are Midoraisa, yeah. So you either get Karis or you're going to get Misa. The other ancestral relationships are punishable by death penalty and the 23 judges. So those first 2 cases are discussed in Siman 15 Tesvav, which we're not going to cover tonight. The third type is punishable through enforcing a negative commandment. And that's really what our Siman is. It's a mamzer or mamzeris, the offspring from an illicit relationship of the first 2 classes of there was 2 people who were incestuous. That child is a mamzer and can't marry. And so therefore that person is
What's that
forbidden
different
to
than a
marry a
mamzer?
Jew that is the offspring of a
What is the
prohibited.
third category different than the mamzer or mamzera?
No, third category is the mamzer and mamzeres. They are the result of a prohibition of the Torah. So the Torah prohibits a man sleeping with another guy's wife, right? So that's punishable by death. That's the second class. The third class is the one punishable by a law, and that is the mamzer. Yeah. Oh, you asked a question? Oh,
No.
your head was just in the air. Okay. And that is that's another example. Another example is suadaka is also not permitted in the same category. Marrying the male descendants of Ammon and Moab is also included in this category. A woman who was divorced from her first husband.
But today we don't know them, so it's not.
Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. But so the next thing I wanted to point out, the Rambam says that that marrying non-Jews are in the second class, or in this third class, excuse me, where the Torah prohibits it, which we'll talk about, which we're not going to talk about tonight, because we're going to talk about Ammon and Moab. So we find that the Rambam also includes any extramarital relationship between a Jewish man and a Jewish woman that can otherwise marry each other. Okay? That's also in the category. There are other Rishonim who disagree with that.
Are they single or are they married?
When they're single, right? So he says that they're two single people that hook up and they have a sexual relationship, and that is a Torah prohibition. Other Rishonim disagree.
How severe? What's the punishment? Law?
They're all law. Yeah, they're all law. So they would come with Malchus. And Yom Hasra, they would come with Malchus. The fourth class are those that are inferred from a positive commandment. So it says, Lo yovo mitzvah Idumiya b'kahal Hashem, right? Egyptian and Edomi are not a lav, but they are lav abal l'kal aseh. Okay? And then the last one, and people who have a doubtful lineage,
Why is it lav abal
prohibited.
l'kal
I'm sorry?
Why is it a lav abba mikalese?
Because mitzvah Idumiya lo yovo b'kahal Hashem is
That's lav.
there's no lav, there's a lav.
That they are allowed on the third,
Yes.
so that's a positive.
Right.
That's a positive essa.
Right, because by the third generation they can.
So it's a isur essa.
Yeah, so it's not a full isser.
No, it's a full isur, just not a
It's
lav.
not a full
Lav.
isser. It's a
Isser
lav
isser.
abal miklah say. So
Yeah.
there's no penalty associated with it
Yeah.
other than having to divorce them. Would be the only penalty. So that is those are the different categories that you can have. Many of them discussed elsewhere. Suadaka is in Simon Hay, and that one's kind of fun, I guess. But anyway, so I wanted to speak about specifically the cases of Ammon and Moab, Mitzri and Idumiya, which is so the beginning over here. And the Torah points out that in this simon he says, Eushem ruin lisa o machmas sul yuchsin o machmas devar sheba gufan o machmas erva. Right? He says that these are categories that we're going to talk about where what keeps them from marrying other Jews is either there's a sul yuchsin, meaning that their lineage is impure, it is tainted somehow, or it is somehow disrupted from a permitted lineage. Or it's because something that happened to their own person, meaning that person himself is excluded by law of the Torah. So the Torah basically said, this person can't marry. That's called machmas gufan. So that person is prohibited.
What?
So like
What is it called?
I'm sorry?
What are they called? Machmos?
Machmas gufan, right? Machmas davar sheba gufan. Something about their person, right? They're excluded because they are the category of Ammon, Moab, Mitzrayim, Edom. And the last one is Machmas Erva, is the category
Edom is
prohibited.
prohibited? Edom is prohibited?
First two generations.
What?
First two generations.
And Edom, right, the first two
The
generations.
first two generations. After they converted, they're still not allowed to marry into the Jewish people which have yichus.
Right.
Only
Okay.
the third generation, then he can marry even to the Soloveitchik family.
Yes, technically speaking, because
And
this really
the
doesn't
same
matter.
thing-
I mean,
the same thing goes for Ammon and Moab too?
Ammon and Moab, it's forever and ever. They
Right,
can only
so-
marry within themselves or any
All
other
right, so
contact.
that's a good introduction to this part over here, which is Ammon and Moab are excluded, and only the Zacharim, and that's because of the way that's how Talmud learned up the pasuk. We know from the book of Rus that Rus herself was a Moabiyah, and that wasn't a problem. That's why the Gemara says in one place David Melech was permitted to continue being the king of Israel because a Moabiyah was on an excluded class, only a Moabi. So therefore, he would not have been permitted to be a king in Israel where he descended from Moab, which we will actually be focusing specifically on that issue in a moment. Let's talk about Ammon, Moab, Mitzri, and Edom. Okay, so Ammon and Moab are excluded by the Torah in perpetuity, but only the males. That's a drasha. Mitzri and Idumiya, right, the Egyptians and Edomites are only allowed to join in the third generation. So there's the first generation, they convert. Okay, that's generation one. They marry somebody permitted to them, which would be another ger. Okay, they can marry a ger or a suffix something or other that they could marry. So it can't be a suffix mamzer because then you'd have a problem. That's something we'll cover tonight. As long as they could be a suffix halal, but basically their children would be restricted. That first generation of children would be restricted from marrying, but that would be, dor sheni that'd be a mitzri sheni basically. And then when their kids have children, that's the third generation that's now Yavo B'Kal Shem. That's the generation that can now marry other Jews. Okay, so there are two classes that the Mitzri and Idumiya could marry. They could marry another convert, and that will get into that in a moment. I don't want to dwell on it too much. I don't want to take up your whole evening. They could also marry anybody else who would be
Not only Mitzri, but a mamzer can marry a convert, right?
Yeah, but
but
we're
then
the children will
trying
be
to be able to get
What?
in Dor Shlishi. So let's
What?
actually use that as an example.
What?
So in order for them to get in for Dor Shlishi, okay, so the generation one is the converted one. So let's say a guy comes and he converts, okay? The child that he has is going to be Dor Sheni. So he either has a permitted relationship, which is he marries another convert woman, okay? Or he marries a Mitzri Rishon, okay? A Mitzri Rishon woman. And then their child will be Mitzri Sheni. The same rule would also actually apply that if he married a Jewish woman, even if it was Be'isr, right? They would just have to break off the relationship. At some point, they would be forced to divorce. But the child that they have would be a Mitzri Sheni. And the reason why is because with the rule amongst Jewish people is that you follow the most pogrom. So the one who has the biggest pagam, the biggest blemish, the biggest black mark, whatever you want to call it, the biggest problem in their pedigree or in their lineage, that sticks to the next generation. So the child from a Mitzri Rishon and a Jewish woman would be a Mitzri Sheni. So that child wouldn't improve their status. They would be Jewish, but they'd still be stuck from marrying into the rest of the Jewish people. Also interesting to note is that if a woman was a Mitzri Sheni and the guy was a Mitzri Rishon, technically the child they have is going to only be Dor Sheni. It's a machlokas actually between the Rambam and other Rishonim. But basically you would have to take the stringent opinion and assume that they didn't actually evolve to generation 3. They're still stuck in generation 2 because the father would be the first generation. And so that
But
would create...
who's after the father, who's after the mother?
He says he goes after the worst.
When you're in the Jewish people, you follow the most pogrom. And the machlokes is whether that applies within the same status. So the Rambam holds that both people have to be the same status level, otherwise you follow the most pogrom. Other Rishonim learn that you would follow the mother's status, and the child would actually be then permitted. So you're stuck in a situation where you're not able to permit this child 100% and still be a suffix.
Machlekes Rishonim.
It's a machlokas Rishonim, and then machlokas Rishonim basically ends up with a suffix.
Who's the other one?
The bar pluktas are the Rush basically, and other
Rush
like
and the Rambam.
Rush and the Ramban. Yeah, the Rambam holds he would follow the most pogrom with it. Amongst the Achronim, the Gra sides with the Rambam because he holds that there's a Yerushalmi that agrees with the sheets of the Rambam. So based on that, you could argue that you would get any further. Now, Ammon and Moab are prohibited in perpetuity even when they convert to Judaism. So what's interesting is that if an Ammoni was still stayed, let's say he was a goy, right? Ammoni had a relationship with a Jewish woman, right? And they gave birth to a child. So the halacha actually is that the child is going to be Jewish and not an Ammoni. However, if the Ammoni converted, Now the Torah's laws apply to him, and he now is the most pugum, right? So the child born, if it was male, would be an Ammoni, and a daughter would be permitted to marry anybody. But as long as he stays a goy, the Ammoni's illicit child that he has, the Jewish woman, so there's a punishment involved.
It's better for him to remain a goy.
It's not better, because that's the problem. Well, let's say this. The child is, if he converts, the child isn't his, so he'd have to have another child.
The outcome for the child might be better.
Okay.
But it's because he's not Misiachis after him. That's
right. So the child wouldn't have a yichus basically because he doesn't follow the father. If an Ammoni married a Mitzri woman, the child, if it was a boy, would be Ammoni because when they're goyim, you follow the father, but when you're amongst the Jews, you follow the mother. So that's just part of the work over there, and that's why I brought up the issue of 19th century civil marriage is because. At that time, the Reform movement wanted to introduce patrilineal descent, and that basically stands in stark contrast with the Masorah because we see clearly that patrilineal descent was only amongst those categories like Ammon and Moab, and everyone else we see matrilineal descent, even in the Torah itself. So if they were trying to establish some precedent for it, it's sorely missing from this cases because it wouldn't make sense that the Ammoni would have would not only would impart non-Jewishness but also impart the Ammoni status on the mother, which flies in the face of the actual halacha itself. So my point to that is that they were just flat out wrong because they didn't really understand the halacha. Because the halacha
They still do that today. They follow that today also.
They follow
what did they
today.
do? I don't understand. What
In 19th century reform wanted to prove patrilineage. I mean, the father's determined
The father's
descent.
Jewish,
So
then
the father's
accept
Jewish,
it
the
as a
mother's So
They accept that today too.
right, they accept it today too, but it clearly stands in the face of thousands of years of halacha, but that doesn't stop them. So, so that's why it's important to understand and establish those things in context, is to understand that patrilineage is actually not a thing in Jewish law. You follow the most pugum, and that's why in a case where somebody's a mamzer, you follow the pugum. Because if the father or the mother's a mamzer or a mamzeres, they impart that to the next child. Why? Because the Torah said so. So it's not because of some decree or decision from elsewhere. These are actually what the Torah responded that are psul machmas darash v'gufan. They themselves are declared a prohibited category. So I want to focus on just one other topic over here, which is what you mentioned, is that these laws no longer apply, which is actually a fascinating halacha, which had implications at the closing of the Hasmonean dynasty and the opening of the Roman occupation of Israel. So we already learned that Mitzri Idumi lo yavo b'kahal Hashem. So the Chazal said they had to talk about cases where people walked in who said they were Mitzri and whatever. And so there's a case, there's a machlokes between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua, who famously argued about all things relating to personal status. So a guy walks in and says he's an Ammoni, and Rabban Gamliel says, well, he can convert, but he can't marry. And so Rabbi Yoshua disagrees. He says, no. He says he's not an Ammoni. He just says he is, but we don't have to believe him. He's a goy. We don't believe a goy on their personal status. And so therefore he's called the parish, river parish, and he's permitted to marry anybody else. And everyone paskins like Rabbi Yoshua in that case. That Gemara is found in Brachos, it's on Daf Chaches. And it's mentioned amongst all those different machloksim that Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua disagreed about. And so as a result of that statement, we now take the approach that Mitzri, Idumi, the Rambam says the approach is the Mitzri, Idumi, Ammoni, Moabi are all now permitted, even if they want to come into the court and claim that they are from those people. We assume that they are not. Why? Because when Sennacherib, Sancheriv, came and conquered the land of Israel amongst other places, He moved people. Sennacherib or Sancherib.
Okay.
Sennacherib is his anglicized or Greek pronunciation. And so his name is actually interesting because his name is actually an homage to, in his language, an homage to his idol. But if you look at it in the Hebrew, it's Sancherib, which means that he did nothing but destroy things. So, it's kind of
in English.
Huh?
Sounds better in English.
Yeah, Sennacherib. Yeah. His father actually was Sargon II, and those of you familiar with Lord of the Rings, I believe Sargon is the one who forges the rings, right? So, interesting choice of names for people. Yes.
Who was the father, you said?
Of Sennacherib, Sargon II.
Who was he?
Sargon was the previous king before him, before the Assyrian Empire became expansive. Sargon actually was the tribute. He was receiving tribute from local nations, and when they didn't get it, they'd rough them up a little bit. It was the mafia for the mafia, and so if they didn't pay you tribute, you didn't offer them protection. Instead, you invaded their lands and took your tribute. And then his son decided, you know what? We're strong enough army, we can go conquer lots of lands, and people are good. So they went and they took people, they went up, moved them around, and so the feeling was that you no longer needed to establish that. One caveat, the Rosh and a lot of other people argue the Gemara says that Mitzrayim was promised to return to their homeland and therefore should be permitted. So they quote the Rosh as saying that Egypt is still in their prohibited status today. Whereas Ammon, Moab, and so on were picked up and moved. So first of all, I'm going to say one quick thing about Moab, and then we'll go back to Edom, because that's where I want to finish off tonight. Mitzrayim, maybe back in the days of the Talmud, maybe all those people went and returned. But the ancient Egyptians at the time, who were the Egyptians at the time of the Exodus of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, were not the people who now inhabit it and haven't inhabited it for the past 1.5 millennia. Because after the Arab invasion, the Islamic invasions of North Africa, those are all people who live there now in North Africa are all Arab and of Arab descent. They are not the Mitzrayim that are referred to in the Exodus.
They chased them out into
and
deep,
so they conquered them, they intermarried them, they moved them around, they scared them away. For whatever it's worth, the majority of people who live there now are descendants from the Middle East, from some other group of people. From whom they descended, we know not. But or at least we haven't done a test to see where everybody's from. I actually saw something interesting. I'll just throw this out as a caveat. They did an exam of descendants of people who live like in Brazil, who are Portuguese. They found that there may be millions of people that have Jewish DNA who are living now in Brazil, who may have been Moranos who fled from Portugal and just settled there and just
they're all over South America.
And so
Mexico, they're all over.
Yeah. So they said that Jewish DNA is super prevalent in South America.
Yeah.
It was one of the interesting studies I saw recently. They haven't really proved it. Their estimates and their mathematical calculations said we're talking about millions of descendants, or at least they contain genetic material that could only have come from Jewish ancestors. So the last one on here is Edom. No one argues on Edom, having been picked up and moved around. But what's interesting is Edom existed all the way into the time of the Roman occupation. Actually, the reason why Rome gets the name Edom is thanks to Herod the Great, who is
Rome occupied Edom too.
Who? Rome?
Rome took over.
So what happened? So what happened historically is Yochanan Kohen Gadol, Yochanan Hyrcanus, or John Hyrcanus, who is known. Yochanan Kohen Gadol was one of the last kings of the Hashmonaim, the Hasmonean dynasty. And he sent an army into what was then known as Idumiya, or Edom, and conquered the rest of the people and forcibly converted them. And the belief is that they were forcibly converted to be servants to the Jewish people, much like the Nesinim were, like the people of Givon. They were converted and were made to practice Judaism. What that means, however, is that they, as a people, were not permitted to marry other Jews. Whereas the Nesinim, at some point, may have been. We're not going to get into that because that's a real dedicated topic that we could get into at some other point. But the Moabim no one believes that they were the original Idumians. So what happened was that when Yochanan Hyrcanus and Yochanan Kohen Gadol conquers Edom, Idumiya, the Idumeans become part of the Jewish people, and they begin to integrate into their society much more. However, they were not all necessarily the original prohibited class. The reason why this is really interesting is because at some point there's a gentleman named Herod ha-Edomi, or the Herod the Idumean, who is basically, he is the son of one of the governors in the area, set up by Yochanan Hyrcanus. And after Yochanan Hyrcanus passes away, his son takes over. But the Romans are the Romans are invited into Israel in order to settle the dispute about who would be king. And Herod sees that as his opportunity to move into a position of power because his father was a well-respected governor in Idumiya. And so Herod moves in and he takes a wife known as Miriam, or Mariam, depending on the way they wrote it in Latin. And he takes himself a wife from the Jewish people. She was a Bas Kohen, technically speaking. So the Gemara in Kedushin takes us off from that point, that at some point Herod believes that there is a revolt being incited against him by the Jewish people. And so, in fact, he's actually referred to as Melech Edom in the Medrash at one point. So this may have been how the Romans got their name Edom. They were invited there by the Idumeans. So Herod goes insane and starts killing people within the family who believe that they have a claim to the throne because they're actually Chashmonaim. One of those people is his beloved wife, Miriam. And the Gemara says, doesn't name her, he doesn't name her in the Gemara, but her name is found in Josephus' Antiquities.
He kills her too?
He doesn't kill her, she throws herself off the roof. But before she throws herself off the roof, she makes an announcement. She says, Kol mish amar bi beis Chashmonai asa avadahu. So it says in Aramaic, everyone who says they come from the Hasmonean house are nothing but slaves. And the reason for that is because her claim was that the Edomites were servants to the Jewish people, and therefore their classification was Eved and not permitted to marry into the Jewish people. And therefore, whatever child that she had, which would have been Agrippus, I believe Agrippus, right? Okay, so that child was not considered a kosher king of Israel. So not only was Herod not acceptable as a king, but neither was any of his children because of the pronouncement she made before her death, actually her suicide, according to the Gemara, of throwing herself off of the roof and making the declaration before death.
That's why Agrippas also was considered not kosher.
That's why he wasn't kosher.
That's why Chazal.
Exactly. And so that was part of the struggle. Part of the big struggle was foreigners who ruled over the house of Israel at the end of that period. So I thought that would be something interesting historically to note how
He had a good relation with Rome. Herod had a good relation.
Herod was their pal. And he invited them in, and they stayed.
So basically, you're saying that the Adoimim is not the one that we forcibly converted?
The original Adomi was prohibited by the will of the Torah. The Torah said, "Mitzri Yadumi lo yavo b'gal Hashem."
Where are they today?
Shlishi. What?
The Adoimim, where are they today? Were they forcibly converted?
So wait, Sancheiriv comes in.
Right. So we don't know.
Idumiya is still there. Edom is still there. And it's there in the days of Yochanan Hyrcanus, but they are converted, but they don't have the status of Edomi, they take on the status of Eved. And the reason why is because Sancheiriv Mevabel Skol is that Sancheiriv came in and mixed up all of
the Edomim that we converted are not the Edomim of Esav necessarily.
Are not the Edomim of Esav at all, correct, because the Halacha that was quoted by Rabbi Yeshua was not challenged by the Edomim, and so therefore they would be considered to be just Stam Goyim, and therefore their conversion would allow them to have a status of joining Jewish people. However, they were entered into the Jewish people through a conversion that turned them into Avadim. And so therefore,
Rabbi Yeshua says, "Kol the Polish merobe Polish."
He does.
Now, so how would we apply the halacha of Ammon and Moab, How would we apply that?
So we would have to
Unless
know
if we
with-
saw him walk out of his house in Idumiya, that's the only way.
So it's interesting you mention that because that's I can actually look at the books anymore, and I'm actually.
If we open up a Beis Din
One
there,
second. Let me just wrap it up on the recording over here, and then we can talk.